Thank you all for being here this evening. My name is Ariana Brown, and I'm a student here at Wellesley. Tonight's event is a collaboration between the Wellesley Retail Network, the Albright Institute, and the BEAM Initiative, and it's very meaningful to bring these communities together for a conversation at the intersection of business, culture, and creativity. I'm truly honored to introduce today's speaker, Pauline Brown, and I'll share full disclosure, I'm a bit biased because she's my mom, but it also means I've had a front row seat to the ideas and perspectives she'll be bringing forward today. Pauline has spent her career at the forefront of luxury and consumer, shaping some of the world's most iconic brands. As the chairman of LVMH North America and the first and only woman in the role, she helped guide strategy, growth, and brand vision at the highest level. After her time at LVMH, she transitioned into academia, where she taught a course called The Business of Aesthetics at Harvard Business School, which challenged future leaders to think differently about the role beauty, creativity, and sensory experience play in the business field. In 2019, she published her book, Aesthetic Intelligence, where she introduces a concept that sits at the center of her work. The ability to perceive, interpret, and create beauty is not just an artistic sensibility, but a powerful and often overlooked form of intelligence, one that drives brand value, shapes consumer perception, and increasingly defines good leadership. What makes her perspective especially compelling is that it pushes against the traditional boundaries of business thinking. It asks us to consider not only what is functional and efficient, but what is meaningful, resonant, and emotionally impactful. Tonight's conversation will be co-moderated by the faculty director of Albright, beloved Wellesley professor and fashion icon, Olga Shurchkov, whose work explores decision-making, incentives, and behavior, as well as gender differences in leadership, bringing another thoughtful lens to tonight's discussion. Together, we will explore the intersection of aesthetics, identity, and leadership, and I hope this conversation resonates with all of you as we think about the kind of leaders we want to enter the world in after Wellesley. Please join me in welcoming Pauline.
Hello, nice to be here back at Wellesley. I can't believe that my daughter is about to graduate. It seems like just a few days ago I dropped her off. And had I known when I was applying to school what a special place this is, it definitely would have been at the top of my list. I should start there. I went to Dartmouth College, which really, especially back in the early to mid-'80s, was the antithesis of the Wellesley that you all are experiencing today. I want to say in my class it was 60-40, men, women. And the culture was even more male-oriented than that ratio would suggest. I had no concept of what I would do with for my career. My mother, who I'm very close with, it was her career to raise her 4 kids. So until the last of the 4 were out of the house, she never had a job. She's a real intellect. She never finished college. There was no purpose. There was no objective to doing so. So she would take courses now and then just out of pure interest. But there was no framing when I grew up about working for anything other than if you had to work for a paycheck. And so when I came out of college, I had no direction. What I had was curiosity, a work ethic, and a willingness to learn and grow. And I would say of those 3 things, I still feel I have that today. I feel I have a work ethic. I feel that I have endless curiosity. And I still, all these decades later, have a more than a willingness, really an eagerness to grow and to change. And that last point, I think, is actually serving me quite well in this chapter because we live in such a fast-changing environment. When I was at the height of my career, at least from a prestige standpoint, I was running a division of LVMH, the North American market. LVMH is by far the world's biggest luxury conglomerate. At the time, it was generating over $50 billion that's $1 billion each year in revenue. It is headquartered in France, but has sales in over 100 markets around the world. There are about 70 brands within the group, everything from Louis Vuitton to Sephora, Christian Dior, many champagne brands, many watch brands, so all these different categories of luxury goods. And I would meet a lot of particularly young women. This is preceding my going into academia, and they would really want to have careers that looked somewhat like my own. And they would reverse engineer. They would say, well, if it took Pauline 25 years to get to the helm of a company like LVMH, maybe if I follow in, and it might have been in 2015, the same track, that I can have a prospect of getting to a same endpoint. And I always say, if Pauline did the same thing 25 or 30 years later, her trajectory would have looked very different, because the world has changed so much. So one of my clear takeaways in thinking back about both what had served me well in my career, but also what I've learned in some cases through hits and misses, is just that willingness to take the world for where it is, and as they say in hockey, to go where the puck is going as opposed to where it came from. I mentioned I graduated from Dartmouth College. I was an English major in college. At the time, I would say it wasn't as unpopular a major as it would be today, but it still wouldn't have been a top 5 among graduates. But when I go back to my alma mater today, I am shocked to see how few people are even majoring in the humanities. And for many, many years, and there's a good reason for that, but for many years, the big push was to study STEM, to have some hard skills, to be more technically prepared for whether it's in the business world or scientific careers. What we're seeing, and for those of you who have majored in STEM, I don't begrudge you that. I think it still is great training, and your careers will work just fine. The learning is still just beginning. But what I will say is that some of those technical skills are the first things that are being disintermediated by machines that process huge reams of data, and they process it really well and really fast and really inexpensively. But what machines don't do, and this really leads me to where I am at this juncture in my career, is that they don't think. They don't have judgment. They don't perceive. When Ari was introducing me, she talked about this form of intelligence, which I'm calling aesthetic intelligence. Some people might more precisely call it perceptive intelligence. And that's how you experience the world around you. That even plants are what we call sentient. Machines are not sentient, right? They don't have feelings. So you don't need a brain to be sentient, but you do need to be living in some form. And why I say all of that is you look forward in the world that we're now living in and the world you're graduating into, I would say in addition to all the things that you've over the last many years been studying and perfecting and refining, in addition to that, just really got to double down on the human skills, the things that the machines aren't going to do better than you, probably in your lifetime. Now, at one extreme of that is art, right? But there are only some of us in this world who are prepared to be artists, who are inclined to be artists, or who even have the gifts to be an artist. And I'm not an artist, so even when I talk about aesthetics, I never use it synonymously with creativity or artistry, which doesn't mean they can't go hand in hand, but it's not a requirement. What is uniquely human is something more universal, more fundamental, and it's what I think of as taste. And taste is not just how things look, but they're really how things feel, right? They're whole ways of expression. People who lead tasteful lives are not just dressing well, they're also people who are making very thoughtful choices about their lifestyle, about their spaces, about how they curate their experiences. And this all goes into the person that we become. They're sort of expressions of our personality, they're manifestations of our curiosities. So we can get a little bit later when I'm sitting down with Olga into what exactly is this idea of aesthetic intelligence, how it gets cultivated, because I treat it as a muscle. I always say this is not an innate gift. This is something that has to be cultivated like any muscle or exercised, and why I believe it is actually more important now than any other time in my life because of the advent of AI and just how pervasive it is in almost every area of processing or functioning that I can think of. I think that just in closing, I will say, you know, when you look at the career of people who are up here speaking to a group like yourselves, often, you know, it's punctuated by the most impressive things they've done, the bullets or the titles and the awards, and, you know, the publications and so forth. What doesn't get told enough is what happened in between all of those bullets, right? So I should just start by saying, or maybe end by saying, when I came out of Dartmouth and I had no role model, because, as I said, my mother wasn't a career woman, there really weren't that many career women, or if they were in the workforce, they didn't necessarily have lifestyles that I emulated or that I thought were models for how I wanted to be. So I sort of had to make it up as I go. And I had to use that judgment, which we're going to talk a little bit more about. And if I talk about the different discrete segments of my career, I spent the first 10 years, actually the first, after business school, I went into consulting. I very quickly wanted to get out of that. I did not want to be a lifelong consultant. And then I spent about a decade in the beauty industry, which is really what opened my eyes to the world of branding. It's really where I learned what a brand is and how you could tell a story through a product or through a counter presentation. And then I went into private equity. So I even had a stint where I was an investor in beauty and fashion brands and other consumer goods. And then only later did I end up back in the world of luxury, which was LVMH. And then post-LVMH, I've been teaching, I write, I do some advisory work. My point is I've done a lot of different things. And prospectively, none of this was part of a strategic plan. The things, though, that never changed, and the things that I would just encourage you all to really spend time with and get close to are my core values. And when I wrote the book, came out about 5-6 years ago, I realized that even though I wore a lot of different hats, many of the things that I was saying in the book were formed in their own way over different stages of my career. And I was able to draw from a lot of different experiences in talking about this concept of aesthetics and talking about what it means, not just in a career or in a company, but really in a life. So I'll pause there. Olga and I are going to engage in a conversation, and then we're going to open it up, and I hope you will feel free to ask whatever's on your mind.
Okay. I think these are on. Yes. Oh, that's loud. Pauline, thank you so much for being here and bringing this amazing insight to the Albright Institute and also to Wellesley College. It happens to be that, you know, in the book you talk about aesthetic intelligence as the other kind of intelligence, AI, you know, being artificial intelligence, and you mentioned that in your opening remarks. There is another AI here, which is the Albright Institute. That's like the triple AI. I kind of love that. And with that in mind, I think what I'd love to do is for us to maybe broaden a little bit the application of your insights from, you know, the branding and marketing in retail, but also to how we can you know, apply these concepts to leadership as a person in policy, politics, and in global affairs. So for everybody here who is interested in careers in global affairs, I believe aesthetic intelligence is very, very important. And this year our theme is the leadership theme in the fragmented world. So I wanted to see how you might think about applying artificial aesthetic intelligence to kind of with this broader lens, cultivating a sense of your code, if you will, from your book, and what does this kind of leader look like who strategically perhaps uses the language of aesthetics, not in a superficial way, but in a deeper way?
Yeah. It's a great question. It's a big question. And actually, there are entire theses that are written about the aesthetics of politics. Let me just step back and say what aesthetics is a little bit more fully. So, as I mentioned earlier, it really isn't about image per se, and it really isn't even just about visual elegance. We often think of things that are aesthetic as looking pretty, but there's a term, I reference it in the book. It comes from the French jolie laid, where jolie is the French word for pretty, and laid is the French word for ugly, and it often gets used to describe a beautiful person's face. You know, think of like an Adam Driver or a Willem Dafoe or Tilda Swinton, where there's something a little off that makes them that much more compelling and interesting and memorable. And so on that, even if when we think of politics, we're really responding to a lot of codes, right? The codes are expressed not just through the way, for example, a politician or a movement. It could be in the MAGA movement. There's a lot of codes. There's the red hat, right? There's a feel. There's mantras or mottos that often go with this. And what's interesting, they've even done research, and they found, for example, that on average, Democrats have a slight bias toward preferring blue to red as a color, and Republicans, with no reference to their politics, have a slight reference for red over blue. So we tend to look at codes with associations. In other words, I think if I found those people when they were 5 or 6, they wouldn't have necessarily fell in those red or blue camps. But over time, if you associate certain colors with certain principles, we tend to like them better. So really what's important with this idea of aesthetics is how it makes people feel. Your affiliation, your connection, or your reversion, right? And I think, going back to your question, if you were designing a campaign for whether it's for a brand or for a movement, a social movement, generally you don't want to start outward in, like what color could we pick that would be the most differentiated from every other color out there, because that doesn't ring as authentic. The most exciting campaigns are one that often, like the MAGA hat wasn't designed as a code. It was designed as, you've got something you got to wear that's very visible, that's in the colors of the party, that has an acronym, because we're not going to put all of those letters on one cap. And then it took a life of its own. So think of codes as byproducts of often a lot of creative decisions that get made over time that become associated with different sentiments or philosophies. And I would say every initiative should have a set of codes that ultimately get associated with it and can be very powerful in terms of mobilizing communities.
Yeah, so I'm picking up on authenticity here too, that like the code will work if it's authentic. And you have this great advice that you give that, no matter what, be authentic, be true to yourself, and, use your personal style, even if it's quirky, right? Mm-hmm. Just don't kind of conform, right, to others' versions of you. At the same time, and you mentioned Secretary Albright in the book as well. She has her own, aesthetic code, and that is the pin, the brooch. And there are all of these, books written about pin diplomacy and so on. And at the same time, her daughter Alice Albright was here and spoke at the Albright Institute, and she was cautioning us against overusing this potentially, stereotypically feminine way of, strategizing and using diplomacy. And it kind of takes me to this double bind, where women maybe are criticized for overusing these types of codes, the more female female stereotyped codes, and at the same time, when they don't use them, when they don't use their stereotypically female traits, they're also punished for that, right? So how would you respond to that double bind? How do we, as women leaders, overcome that tension?
Well, so I say two things, and I'm speaking as much from a very personal conviction as maybe a more dispassionate one. Number one, I would rather women turn their femininity into a source of power than feel that they have to replicate male-encoded behavior in order to project power. And I know that that can be a setup because there are associations that other people may have. But I think women often underestimate just how emboldening being who they are in whatever form. And I wouldn't feign femininity if that isn't what comes from within. But I'm going to take an example that I think, and I'm going to take maybe two examples if we're going to talk politics. AOC, right? She has people who adore her, and she has haters. But I would say she's winning for it. In the brand world, you're better off having 10% of the consumer population love you and 90% hate you than having 90% feel indifferent, right? And I think that actually came back to haunt Kamala a bit in the last election, that we didn't see her as fully. She felt in her presentation, forget the words, but we're perceiving candidates and ideas as much through the messaging, through the nonverbal communication, as through the actual hardcore, comments and speeches. And I think she didn't project that level of authenticity that most of us find refreshing. You could take at the other end of the spectrum somebody like a Bernie Sanders, who obviously is not projecting any feminine elegance, but you see him, and he's so consistent. And who we see is very, I always say great aesthetics is really just a really powerful outer expression of an internal value system. And if you can see people fully, you know where they stand, and you decide at that point, do you like them or do you not? But I think he's taken his own aesthetic posture as well as anybody in office. And it stood him well over a few decades, even if it almost seems antithetical to what I'm talking about when it comes to aesthetics.
So basically you're saying that you can't avoid being seen as someone with a style of some sort, right?
Being without style is a choice. You're making choices no matter what. You can make a choice to do it as authentically as possible. You can make a choice to feign something, which also doesn't work. Or you could make a choice to just ignore the reality of that altogether. And that's a choice as well, but then you're also giving up a potential, an opportunity to express yourself in a way that can be very empowering.
So I'll go there a little bit, right? So kind of playing the devil's advocate, because I really, really do think that you're absolutely right. But, there are some skeptics out there, right, who would say, well, this is like coming from a place of privilege that, not everybody can sort of use this method of leadership and, with style being a very, kind of privileged and expensive thing to go after. So how might you address the skeptics who might worry that encouraging women to sort of use strategically this method, right, the image simply could reinforce like the systems, right, that are unjustly judging them, essentially.
So thank you for bringing that up. And it's important because I think often people would assume, if it's coming from someone who worked at the likes of LVMH, that this is a asset for those that can afford luxury. Let me say that in every culture, in every time in history, going back thousands of years, people had a style and expression. There's nothing new about that. You can find very primitive tribes where they still had, bejeweled themselves and tattooed themselves and found different ways to express whether they were in this group or they. So that is human. We're the only species that do this. Animals may prefer a soft bed to a hard one, but they don't create art. Maybe with the exception that birds sing. And that could be even for reproductive reasons. If you look at from an economic standpoint, there's no rationale for us to create art. Most people lose money on art. It is not a lucrative field for the vast majority of art that's created. So that's point number one. Point number two, that when it comes to taste, which is different than art, there is no correlation between the amount of money people have and spend and the quality of what they're expressing. In fact, in my experience, people who have unlimited means often have worse taste because a big part of that is trade-offs, is having the restraint to know I can't have everything. So the things I do, whether I, wear, if I'm going to wear one thing, it's going to be something that matters. If I'm going to make some statement, that choicefulness is part of what good taste is all about. And I've traveled far and wide. I've been to Haiti. I've been to, I was in Peru and rural Peru over the holidays. I see it everywhere. I see it. You see it in the weavers and in the knitters in the Faroe Islands. I think people make beautiful things, and that compulsion, that distinctly human compulsion to surround ourselves with that which looks and feels great, is universal.
And that's super interesting, and I would love to go to a little bit more concrete examples, maybe, because, so I don't know if it was your podcast or your book, but somewhere I read about your interesting insight on fonts and using fonts, and, because when we write and communicate, we communicate, in a written form as well as in spoken form, and I think both of those also obviously communicate something about style, right? So I'm curious if there's something analogous to quote unquote like fonts in, personal presence, like cues that would shape how someone is read literally as a person. Like, is there anything concrete you could give us an example of that would be something that is a font or slash, a personal way of speaking or communicating that isn't, successful and something that would be. Or does it really depend on the person?
It isn't so much that there are certain fonts that are more conducive to success than others. It's more whether it's coherent. So, for example, if I were starting a brand, and it's a tech brand, and the values of the culture of the company, of the founders, of what we're trying to convey is all about innovation, about modernity, about rule breaking, there are certain styles of font that will convey that. And if I used a Times New Roman with lots of serif, it would fly in the face. And it's not that people would consciously look at that font and say, I don't believe these people. It's more of an instinct. When we see things, our eyes pick up a lot that our minds may not fully register. And so I think some of it is just coherence. And going back to the question of how do you cultivate that, how do you become more discriminating in knowing whether that font is true to the message I'm trying to convey, or the mood, more importantly, the mood I'm trying to convey? Well, that you have to start, first things first, you have to just be aware, how do I feel when I read, let's just say, the Wall Street Journal every day with one very particular font, the New York Times with another, and the Financial Times with another. The Financial Times, to boot, is on a salmon-colored, light pinkish paper. That has an impact on me. I'm not saying one is a better newspaper than the other, but I'm aware that it leaves a bit of a different imprint as I'm reading, and that awareness is where it all starts.
Got it. So again, consistency. I'm hearing that you have to be true to yourself, to your brand, and as well as like your style, and so it has to be all consistent, right? So I want to come back also to AI, right? Let's face it, it's here, and in your book you're very optimistic, and in your opening remarks as well, which is great. I am optimistic too. I think that there's no better time than now to utilize our critical thinking that liberal arts teaches us. We're seeing that now more than ever. And there's need for humanities and the study of language, the study of culture, to truly differentiate ourselves, right, from the machines and the coding and so on. But, with all that optimism, still, we're seeing that a lot of images online are being generated with AI, and somebody could actually write in a very polished way, seemingly, or appear very polished, but it is actually, false, right? It's AI. So with everything being online now on social media, like we're seeing these images, and we can't help but be influenced by them. And so I wonder if you have an answer to this question of like whether AI can disrupt and potentially undermine like the value of true taste.
What I'm seeing so far is it's actually heightening it. So it's a little bit like if you spent a month eating nothing but McDonald's, and then all of a sudden somebody took you to a Michelin restaurant, it would be, exquisite, an exquisite experience in a way that would be so much more elevating than if every day of the week you had, a fine meal at home. And I think what's happening right now, first of all, every hour that we spend looking at a screen is an hour that our senses are understimulated. Even our eyes, which are overstimulated looking at screens, I would argue are under-enriched because it's very flat images. It tends to be small, pixelated in these sort of consistent little squares, and we're looking on so that experience, a lot of who we are, the human experience was not, it was not, we are not wired for the world we live in today. We're really wired for, tens of thousands of years of existence that have no bearing on how we actually live today. And so two things happen when we spend those hours on the screen. One is even our eyes get very fatigued, which would never happen if I was looking at a sunset in a beautiful environment, right? The dimension of it and the colors of it and the nuance of being in space has a very different effect on even that one sensory modality. And then think about all the other modalities that aren't even activated at all, right? One of the things we found during COVID was the first time in human history where you had a very large segment of the population that had lost their sense of smell for a long period of time. We'd never been able to study what happens to people. Before COVID, people assumed that if they had to lose one of their senses, if they had to forego, that would be the first one that 90% of the population would happily give up. Nobody wants to give up their vision or their hearing. However, when we actually studied what happens to people who lose their sense of smell, the rates of depression and anxiety were higher than if people lost other senses. And why? Because your sense of smell is much more connected to your memory center and to your emotional well-being than was ever understood. The reason I share this with you is we don't know, relative to how much we know about certain technological matters, we don't know that much about the human senses. We're still learning. But one of the things we do know is that they are a lot more powerful in framing our lived experience than is credited. And we know that they actually interact a lot more. So we don't, for example, just have 5 senses. Some scientists think we have as many as 54. We have at least 18. We just simplify it. And even with the 5 senses that we often talk about, there's a lot of interactivity. So for example, if you give people the same dessert, the exact same dessert, but you serve one on a black plate and one on a white plate, people consuming it from the white plate perceive it as sweeter. So there's a lot of interactivity between our senses. You see it between sound and between, even why people have certain eating habits when they're on an airplane that they don't have when they're on the ground. So all of that's to say we live in our bodies. We don't live as much in our heads as the screen time is dictating. And so what happens, going back to your question, is when we have an experience that actually is multisensory, that is immersive, that is rich and engaging, it is almost overvalued because we're like a plant that needs to be watered.
Wow, I love that. I mean, it's such an important thing to hear, I think, especially as a mom of like a 12-year-old boy who is immersed very much in these screens. I think like it's hard to not see it as a big evil and basically be pessimistic about it. But I mean, I can see the value of human experience, the value, and really the value proposition of Wellesley College, aesthetics. All of these real experiences matter even more. So that's wonderful. I'd like to maybe shift gears a little bit and talk about, you mentioned role models. You know, you mentioned being the first and only woman chairman of LVMH, and you know, you entered many male-dominated spaces. And you know, just in your career and your experiences. Yeah, I mean, how did you approach being that person who, first of all, you know, even though you said, and you mentioned to me, you know, that, you know, at first maybe you hid your true self a little bit, right? And we all kind of do it. I mean, certainly prior to tenure, I would not even have my hair down. Like that was something I would also hide, right? But then, you know, you come into your true authentic self and you enter those spaces with confidence. How did you do it?
Well, one is getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, and specifically, you know, from an early stage, I always had, and to this day, I always feel an outsider, and I don't mean that in an unfortunate way, but I'm a first-generation American, so even though I grew up in a suburb of New York, a Jewish American family. I grew up amid a community of mostly other American Jews, but most of them were much more settled in the community. Their home life had just a different culture than mine. And so I came into, just at the earliest stages, feeling a little bit different. In fact, when I look at my closest friends in high school, they were all foreign. And many of them since are often foreign-born. So it's just a connection and an identification. And then I found when I went to Wharton, I mentioned when I was at Dartmouth, it was only 40% female at the time. When I went to Wharton for business school, it was only 27% female at the time. So if one felt distorted, Wharton really felt distorted. I was very othered. And you have a choice when you're in a setting like that, and it could be, you could be one of the, 10 or 15% people of color in a room. You have a choice. You can either blend and sort of adopt behaviors that, are sort of transcendent of your natural culture, or you double down and you say this, I've got to find my own groove within that, or create my own community within that. So I think from various stages, sort of figured out how to, and it's its own form of leadership, but really how to be my own person in environments where I wasn't given permission or even necessarily encouraged to be a bit different. And to this day, I mean, flash forward a couple of decades, the first time I taught in a university classroom, there was no preparation for being a professor. I didn't go back to school to be that. But you sort of, over time, if you challenge yourself enough, you may not master the skills for any next challenge, but what you do get is a resourcefulness that you're going to figure it out, a little bit of a trust in yourself that it doesn't depend on the environment to kind of take you through. And I think that that's just been, well borne out over a lot of challenging experiences.
And just to kind of follow up on that, what about role models? You said you didn't have any, at least at the beginning, but I know certainly from my research on gender gaps and the important impact of role models on confidence and women, becoming more competitive, becoming more likely to take on these leadership roles and so on. So did you have role models like that?
Professionally, I did not have a person that I felt, at least in the latter many years, that took me under his or her wing. I would say in the earlier years, there were a few men who were quite paternal, and I learned a lot from. But more importantly, you will be lucky if you find one person who is your mentor. And I've tried very hard to mentor other women along the way. But I can't mentor everybody who I ever cross paths with. So, you will be lucky if you find that person. What will not take luck is to say, for everybody I meet, I have something to learn from them. And particularly when you see people being successful in ways that you admire, even if you wouldn't want to be successful quite like them, just to take a moment to observe what do they have in the way they present themselves, in a skill set that they've developed, in choices that they've made. What can I learn? Because we can learn from a lot of people. The other thing I want to say is you don't just learn from people who are up the ladder. You can learn from people who are your peers. And I still learn to this day from my mother, who, as I said, she never had a career, but she has wisdom, she has judgment, and she's articulate. So I wouldn't confine, where you seek those forms of mentorship just to somebody who you professionally admire.
Wonderful advice. Yes, I completely agree with that. And my last question, and then we'll open it up to the audience, my last question is really about kind of the idea of having it all. And I hate to say those words because they're a myth. I really think so. I really think so. But sometimes people might look at you and say, well, wow, Pauline has it all. But we know that there is a big juggle, for us as women, but also just as people, right? There is family, there is career, there are other, pieces to it. How did you solve that puzzle of really not having it all, but prioritizing, perhaps? Yeah.
Well, so first of all, it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. It was very clear to me from a young age. I wanted kids. So that was not negotiable. Fortunately for you, and unfortunately for me, like nowadays there are many more ways to arrive at it. But the technology wasn't where it was 25 years ago. So that gave me a window, and it gave me a priority that for sure forced me to make different decisions in that time, in that period of time. But as I said, here I am now, I'm approaching 60, and I'm still working, and I'm still productive. And I'm productive in different ways today than I was 10 or 20 years ago. So I guess I would say two things. Number one, you have to look at the portfolio not in any one narrow slice of time, but really over the course of many years. And even over the course, which was probably the most pressure-packed when my kids were still young and at home, and I was working at a pretty high level, I had to make trade-offs. There were times I had to, have a boss or a client be disappointed in me because I had to give priority elsewhere, and there were times I had to have my kids be disappointed in me because I had to make a trip. And if you're doing all of that, and you're a perfectionist, and you're a pleaser, and you expect it all to come together in a short period of time, you're trapped. Then the answer is absolutely not. If you take a longer-term view and you say, the most important things I have to do very well. The less important things I may just do well enough. And there are other things I have to say no to, but I'm clear what the priorities are. I think we can do a lot more than we give ourselves credit. And the other point I'll make, though, often we think of the trade-off as something between career and family, when in fact, I've always had outside interests. I've always had a rich group of girlfriends, and I invest in that. And I know many women who, when they're at the height of their careers or under great pressure, that's the first thing to go. Maybe their health is the first thing to go. And the problem is there are certain things we do that actually aren't just requiring time, they give us energy. And we have to make time for things that give us more energy so that we have more in order to give to those other parts of our life. So being aware, not just where you're spending your time and where you're not, but are you spending your time on things, are you investing in things where you actually are getting more resources back than you're even giving? That's another consideration.
No, this is fantastic, and this really resonates with me. We had a speaker come through here during COVID, Dr. Beverly Danielle Tatum, and she is an educator, and she said something very similar. Where I love her quote. She said, when you make a lot of withdrawals, you have to make a lot of deposits, right? And investing in that energy renewal, right, is a really key piece of the puzzle. Well, it's enough of me talking. I would love to hear a lot of questions from the audience. So many of you are here, and I recognize a lot of you, so I'm sure there will be some really, really good questions. No pressure. Just kidding. Luna? Yeah, over there? Or, yes, Jingru. Sure, and then we'll go to Luna after that.
Okay.
Perfect.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking with us today. I really appreciated all your insights into especially like the new sensory research, and learning about that has been really fascinating. And then I think throughout the conversation, something that I kept thinking of was this concept of like personal brand. Mm-hmm. And although I've like heard a lot about it on the internet, I was kind of at a crossroads, because throughout the conversation, we've talked a lot about the power of consistency and how that builds almost like a credibility. But I'm wondering, how can we do that without kind of bucketing ourselves into one type of label? And how can we continue to expand our horizons and learn and pursue other endeavors without losing that consistency?
Yeah, it's a great question. A couple of thoughts. First of all, the most interesting brands, the ones that we gravitate to, the ones that stand the test of time, are never tightly labeled. They usually have a lot of different dimensionality to them. I mean, I could take in the luxury world, even a brand like a Chanel, right? There's a part of it that's the heritage, and it goes back to a woman and the sort of World War I era Paris, and later some of her story as she fled to Saint-Tropez, and there's sort of the story of that woman and her journey and how she modernized a way of dressing with style that had not been seen before. And then there's a whole other dimension to a brand like Chanel that is very much of the 21st century, that is sort of emanated out of more recent designers and collaborations that maybe has nothing to do even with fashion. And I could say the same thing about Nike, right? Or Starbucks. These are powerful brands. None of them are that simple or narrow or two-dimensional that, and if they were, they would be uncool as quickly as they ever became cool. Number two, I wouldn't think about your brand is something that other people will define for you. What you want to be able to project is as fully as you're comfortable and ready as who you are and what you believe. And that's going to change over time. How I express my values today are very different than 20 years ago, and some of that is the effect of aging and time and lifestyle, and some of that's the effect of being in 2026 instead of 2006, and different influences, right? My next book is all about how taste gets shape and how it evolves. And a lot of it has nothing to do with ourselves. It's what's happening in the world around us. And so I think a little bit allowing yourself to grow. You are way too early in your development to sort of land on a brand, which doesn't mean you shouldn't be aware that you're telling a story and you're being perceived. But I would say the best you can do at this stage is just show your specialness as fully as you feel it.
Thank you so much. Excited for the...
Hi, thank you again for coming. I had a question. You said that like graduating from college, you weren't exactly sure of what you wanted to do, and then you mentioned how you started in consulting. And I wanted to ask, how did you discover your passion for luxury branding, as well as like how did you not stay stuck in something that you realized that you didn't really want to do, and how were you able to sort of take that risk, especially considering that you didn't like you mentioned how your mom was like a stay-at-home mom, so it didn't really seem like you had anyone in your family that was doing that.
Yeah. It's a great question. And I think the one thing I would share with all of you is, to the extent you can refrain from feeling you need an answer, right? Because the answer may come to you in a way that wouldn't even be available to you today. When I So first of all, when I came out of Wharton, I didn't have any vision, but I knew I wanted to be in business. I knew I wanted to be with smart people. I knew I was graduating with a lot of debt, so was making very practical decisions. And I was recruited by Bain here in Boston. I worked for 2 years for Bain, and I took it on for two reasons. And the one was just a very practical one, that it paid for my second year of business school, so it was a good financial decision. And the second is because I didn't know, I wasn't ready to settle on anything. And so it just almost felt like a way to continue my education and to continue to put certain skills to work while I was seeing the world. Now, the reality is, it's not like after doing that for 2 years, all of a sudden I kind of stumbled into luxury goods one day and I said, this is what I want to do. It wasn't quite that crystallized. The turning point for me was when I knew I didn't want to spend. I knew that there was something not fulfilling for me in being a planner and being an analyst and in having my product be a deck. That I felt in the world of business, if anything, I wanted to be more like our clients, where they were closer to the problem and closer to the product line. But still, that leaves open a lot of options. I went to a coach at the time. We called her a counselor. She had me do an exercise. And I share this because it's an exercise that really illuminated things a lot for me. She gave me about 100 different cards, and on every card there was a descriptive that you could ascribe to a job or a career. It could be anything as sort of basic as you get your own office, or predictable hours, to full of international travel, or opportunity to make a big bonus. I mean, it was every kind of way you might describe a job. And I had to put all of those different descriptives into one of three piles. One was highly desirable, one is highly undesirable, and then one was neutral. Like, doesn't bother me, but I wouldn't prioritize it. And then she told me to take my cards that were in the highly desirable pile, of which I probably had 25 or 30, and I had to pick my top 10. Now that starts to get hard right at that point, because you really have to think about what's really important to me. And then when I went through that exercise, she said, now you've got to force rank them. And that's very hard. But the reason I share this with you is, to this day, when I think of the things I put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, those really became my non-negotiables. One of the things that I realized had surfaced in a way that I could not have predicted, doing something like this in a vacuum, was how much I gravitated to and wanted to be working with very creative people. I thrive with creative people. My close friends are always sort of have a creative bent. They're a little eccentric, and they're expressive and experimental. I don't need to do creative work, but I need to be with people who live and breathe in the world of ideas and, what now I would call maybe also aesthetics and aesthetic philosophy. So I take that one, and I take some of the other things that were really, really important to me, and then all of a sudden, certain industries or certain functions start to sort of emerge out of that exercise. And so the reason I'm sharing all this with you is, if you start with your values, and not the ones that are nice to have, but really the ones that make you your best, that helps a lot in defining the kind of environment you want to be in. I would rather be in the wrong job in the right environment than be in the right job in the wrong environment.
Hello. I wanted to thank you for what you said regarding about the universality of the human experience, and also how these in-between moments are actually essential and not secondary to a very authentic process of becoming. But I wanted to particularly ask for your advice in this changing world, and amid a lot of uncertainty, young people find it difficult to build trust in themselves and also develop this sense of mindfulness and intentionality, and learning how to thrive while being uncomfortable?
Well, the first thing is, and I'm guilty of this as well, but I think if we need a lot more discipline about spending our waking hours offline. I think there's so much more clarity in nature and in connection with other people, face to face. And we have an epidemic of loneliness and isolation. And I think the whole thing is just being so exacerbated by social media, and it's just creating a lot of distortions and a lot of confusions. I would say the second thing is, because what we're seeing right now, it is going to level out, meaning we're sort of like in the eye of the storm, and it's going to be a couple of years, and it's unfortunate for you that you're kind of coming into the workforce while the storm is still very tempestuous, but it is going to, we are going to normalize, whether it's because we're going to start to create regulations that don't exist right now, whether it's because we're going to have more clarity on how systems prevail, because there's going to be a new crop of careers that we can't even envision that come out of the other side of this. And so, they always say I heard this actually from a naval officer or a former naval officer once, that if you're ever in a storm in the ocean, if you're thrown off a boat, like the worst thing you can do is panic, because you need to shore up your energy. And if you just sort of wait for the tide to take you. So I would really caution people right now to just try to move slow when everything else is moving fast, to be a bit patient, to make the best decisions we can with what we know, and to maximize the time that we spend with other humans in natural environments.
Hi, my name is Catherine Law. I'm a sophomore. Thank you, Ms. Brown, for speaking with us today. You mentioned the quote, "From everyone I meet, I have something to learn from them," and also the importance that you find in surrounding yourself with creative people. So I have two questions, and number one is, how do you navigate relationships vertically and also horizontally between peers, given how far you've gone in your journey, roles, and experience? And number two, within this realm, how do you seek or identify someone who's authentic in their aesthetic and taste, and then say, this is someone I want to work and partner with in business?
Yeah, those are great questions. So first of all, with regards to relationship building, and that's very important, very important. There are people that I've met in passing that have become lifelong friends. One of them, I was in a job now 20 plus years ago, and I interviewed her for a role. She didn't end up taking the role, but we stayed in touch. And she now has mentored my daughter. She went to Wellesley, and she's how we met Olga. And I just say that because I've interviewed hundreds of people, many of whom, if I passed them on the street and we recognized each other, we'd certainly be friendly, but it wouldn't necessarily have evolved into a friendship. And for it to evolve in a friendship didn't take me cultivating it as somebody as an interviewer. It really took her investing in it, and not investing in it because she wanted the job. She had moved on, went to business school and so forth, but because she had something to give as well. So even if you're seeking that mentor, always know you have something to give, and be mindful when you reach out, not just what you need, but what you have to offer, or what you could potentially offer. It'll go a long way. Number two, just like I said, in careers and in your life plan, take the long road. In relationships, take the long road. They take a long time to build in a very trusting way, and it's a little bit like a garden that you have to keep planting and fertilizing and tending to, and some seasons are going to be better than others, but it for me, investing in in people who are turned into my support, and I'm not just talking in work, I'm even talking in nannies and tutors and people who were very much part of my home ecosystem. The trust that they've given back and our ability to invest in each other has made my life both better and richer for it. So I take a great pride, but also I put a lot of energy into those relationships wherever they are, upwards, sideways, downwards, and across. With regards to my seeing other people and appreciating their aesthetics, it's a little bit like a personality. If I asked you, well, how do you identify when people have a genuine personality versus when they're faking it? Well, you just kind of know. You feel it. Some of it could be the sort of coherence of it. Some of it could be the comfort that some people express, in the way that they're sending out messages. And some of it is just an alignment between, sometimes different styles fit well together and sometimes they don't, and being aware of, your own chemistry in the way that you are with all friendships and relationships. So I don't think there's really an analytic process, but it's a strongly felt instinct that I think everyone should be attuned to, because whether we acknowledge it or not, we are responding to people positively, negatively, through all of these different cues. And I think the more aware we are, just the more mindful we can be, and the more we can surround ourselves with people that are enriching, relationship-wise and otherwise.
Maybe one more question? Oh, down here, Isabel, right here.
So excited to have you here. The first part of my career was in luxury retail at LVMH and Neiman Marcus, and the second part of my career is working here at Wellesley, and I love it. But I'm in a career change now, which is interesting, pivoting to the aesthetics that we're talking about tonight. And I just wonder if you had advice about the opportunities that you see in the changing retail landscape, kind of what's happening now.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, it's a hard time in retail, particularly in luxury retail, because people are just saturated with stuff, right? We don't need more stuff. On the other hand, when a store, assuming you were in traditional bricks and mortar store, when they do their job well, meaning they curate well, they present well, they serve their customer well, they're still very exciting places. So most people, especially when it comes to categories like fashion and accessories, they prefer to go in the store. I mean, how often have we all ordered online and everything can look good in that little pixelated image? But rarely when it comes in does it live up to your imagination, or if it does, it's here and now and not forever. So I think if your passion is to go back into the space you were once in, I would find stores that you think are really have the ingredients to do what they do well. They're not going anywhere. And again, it comes down to the three basics of, are they making good buying choices? Are they serving their customer in a way that is really value add and supportive? And are they presenting and telling a story through their merchandise in a way that makes it exciting to walk into that store? Those are the things. And I would look at your prospects as you do a customer, because that will give you clarity on whether it's a strong proposition or not.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I wanted to just make sure that everybody saw the book. It looks very aesthetically pleasing and should be read. It's a wonderful read. Thank you, Pauline, so much. It's just such a pleasure.
Thank you. Good luck to all of you.
Thank you all for being here, and good luck. Yes.